So our first speaker tonight is Dumisani Washington. Like I said, is the founder of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. He's also a published author, musician, and a pastor. So please welcome Dumisani Washington.
What I want to share on tonight, in advance of Kalev coming, because Kalev will deal with a different portion of this same topic here in Israel, starting with Dr. King's pro-Israel legacy. From there, we'll talk a little bit about the multi-ethnic diversity of Israel as a nation, and then we'll end briefly with the discussion of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction, and we'll kind of see how those three are connected together. So I'll start with this first part here. Again, I'm Dumisani Washington with the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, and our organization very much finds much of its roots and identity in Dr. King's legacy that he left behind where Israel is concerned. The screen that you see there is a quote which is probably one of his most famous quotes. Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968. 10 days before his assassination, he was at the 68th Annual Rabbinical Assembly, a convention for Rabbinical Assembly of Conservative Judaism. And after the time of a speech that he gave, there were questions and answers that kind of similar as we'll all do here tonight. And the rabbis gathered there asking them a host of questions from the Middle East to domestic policy in the United States. And one of his most famous quotes was actually in response to a three-pronged question that was posed to him by Rabbi Gendler on that day. And so the quote there, as you see there, I'll just read that little snippet there, and it's the end of a statement that he made. I see Israel as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world, and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land almost can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. He ended here because he was, like I said, spoke on three different things, because the question that he was asked was about three different things. They were along the lines of race, which we'll discuss. They were along the lines of the Israelis specifically, and then also the Arab people. And so he answered each of those questions there. And one of the first part was the race part. The rabbi asked him, and this is kind of will be interwoven in what we discuss here today too. The rabbi was curious about what was going on within the Black Civil Rights Organization, within the Black Civil Rights Movement in the late 1960s, and what was called then and still referred to now as the militant movement, if you will. It was typified by one of the groups, for example, like a Black Panthers. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism within the groups. So one of the rabbis asked Dr. King about it specifically. He says, what do you say about those types of things? He even referenced what he talked about. The rabbi said, I spoke with a black journalist who says that the black people support the Palestinians in this struggle because color is all important in this world. Now, there's all kinds of things wrong with the question, and Dr. King took it apart and he answered different sections of the question. The first part of it deals with race. He says that there are some that are so color consumed that they see a kind of mystique in color, and anything non-colored is condemned. And he said, we do not follow that course. That was his first course. As a matter of fact, if you are familiar at all with his 1964 speech in Washington, D.C., I Have a Dream, he made a statement not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His first answer to the rabbi was along those same lines. He was saying that we judge the situation based on its merits, is the first thing that he said. And then he moved on to peace for the Israelis. He said, peace for the Israelis means security, and we must strive with all of our might to protect its borders. The last thing that he said is also that peace for the Arabs, he says, means economic security. So what Dr. King proved and what he embodied was that it was not necessarily to be anti-Arab, to be pro-Israel. So he spoke on behalf of the Israeli people, and then he spoke on behalf of what was needed in the Arab world. And what he called for was specifically, he used the term, there needs to be a Marshall Plan. And Marshall Plan refers to after the Second World War, when the United States and others helped rebuild the European economy. And Mr. Kalev Myers will say some more about that a little bit later on. He said there needs to be a Marshall Plan where the Arab population is lifted out of illiteracy and poverty and disease. He's talked about what's going on in that part of the world, and this is what needs to happen, not just for Israel, he said, but he was referring to the world community. He mentioned those things as a concern, and that was the ending of his particular statement proving in terms of his Israel advocacy, if you were. And it was always a balanced one. It was always a solidarity with Israel and also a concern for the people, the Palestinian people. After addressing each of those three things, the Marshall Plan portion of it is part of the thing that kind of stands out. And it stands out for our discussion here tonight because, as you'll hear some more later on, what has happened in the Palestinian Authority in terms of money, whether it's through international organizations and whether it's through other Western democracies, some, and you'll hear about this later on, the amount of money that far exceeded even what Dr. King had said, and poverty persists. Does that mean we know exactly what Dr. King would say about it right now? No. But we are applying the words that he spoke then. And the words that he spoke then were concern for the Arab people, that there was a Marshall Plan, that there were large sums of money to go to establishing strength, establishing a secure economy there for the people. One of the reasons why we start with this with the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel is because by now, some almost 50 years after Dr. King's assassination, his name and his image has been used for lots of different causes, and particularly as it comes to human rights, and rightly so. Unfortunately, within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, his name and his words are often used in the opposite way that they were intended. In other words, Dr. King would not have been in favor of boycott, divestment, and sanction, and we'll talk about that why, because that's not about peace and discussion, that is about diminishing, and that is about dismissing. Dr. King, even at that time, if you recognize the date, I said that he spoke those words on March the 26th, 1968. If you're aware of all of the Middle East history, that was almost a full year after the 1967 war, in which Israel preemptively struck Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Dr. King was expected by some to make some dismissing or at least critical statements where the Israeli government was concerned, and he did not. Do we know exactly what he felt about it? No, he didn't divulge those feelings. But these statements that he made about Israel's security was made almost a full year after June 1967. And so part of what we do is we establish what his actual legacy was and making sure that we are not A, revising history, or B, amending his views for today. And this is part of the beginning of the discussion here. The last portion of it, Dr. King, is that part of his legacy lived on through some of his closest advisors. There's a picture that you see there. The two gentlemen on the left and right, the far left, is Bayard Rustin, one of his advisors. He was one of his closest advisors that dealt with his nonviolent protest. And the other person next to him is A. Philip Randolph, again, a stalwart within the civil rights community. Those two gentlemen, along with others, formed in 1975 an organization called BASIC, Black Americans to Support Israel Committee. And they formed it specifically because of the UN resolution that was moving through, that was actually passed, that infamous resolution 3379, Zionism is Racism. Dr. King's colleagues gathered together, both not just because of his memory, but because of their standing for the only democracy in the Middle East, and they garnered support. They took out an ad in the November 23rd, 1975 edition, after the resolution had passed. They took out an ad in the New York Times, and some 200 who's of African-American community signed on to it, basically denouncing and decrying the resolution and also expressing their solidarity with Israel in some of the same verbiage that Dr. King did as well. Which moves us to this next portion here now today. And this portion here is about Israel's multi-ethnic society. And you see parenthetically, and the racism of Israel hatred. See, the question that the rabbi asked Dr. King, part of it had to do with race. And when Rabbi Gender asked him, what do you say, Dr. King, to those in the black community, he said, that stand against Israel because, quote, color is all important in this world. And then the rabbi explained the question some more. He said, Dr. King, should we tell them that over half of the Jews in Israel are actually of Middle Eastern descent? That name within the Hebrew tongue, the Mizrahi, which means Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. He said, Dr. King, should we discuss that? Dr. King didn't address that part. He just addressed the first section of it and then went on to Israel's security and to the security of the Arab people. But what is true here is that one of the greatest criticisms And one of the greatest tools, unfortunately one of the most effective tools in dismissing Israel, is on the basis of race, ironically. That same question that was asked of Dr. King. In other words, oftentimes the way that Israel is dismissed by its detractors as it being a white, European, colonizing imperialist power, those words would be used by Israel's enemies. Those words were used by Premier Nasser of Egypt. Those words were used by PLO's Yasser Arafat. And it was to sell a narrative that they knew was not true. They knew that though there were Jews who came from Western Europe and from Eastern Europe, there were Jews who came from Yemen and Morocco and Egypt and Iraq and Iran, and not just came, but were forced out of those communities. That they were people of color just as much as the Palestinians were people of color. But they felt that if they could hide that fact from the Western world, they could sell the reestablishment of Israel as a colonizing power. And that worked effectively, and it's still, unfortunately, having a certain amount of effect today. So what you're seeing on the screen there is what the rabbi was saying, but just in modern day. This young lady particularly is what the Jewish people call from the tribe of Bnei Manasseh, which is the tribe of Manasseh. She just recently, with Shavei Israel, just made Aliyah, which means to come back to the land, which has been happening since 1948, since Israel was reestablished. This narrative had always been a reality. Beta Israel, young Ethiopian Jews. These are not just Israeli citizens, these are Jewish people. The rabbi again asked, Dr. King, should we tell them that over half of the Jews in Israel are actually Mizrahi? What should we say about this, Dr. King? Miss Israel 2013. Israel's detractors will even dismiss these tokens. How can they be tokens if they're Jewish people? How can they be tokens if they've made Aliyah and have come back home? Some after some 2,500 years of exile. So when it comes to the dismissing of the Jewish people, one of the things that we like to do in the IBSI, Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, is put a face to the rhetoric, to come against the false narrative, to teach that Jews are black, white, and brown, and why it's so important for everyone to recognize that that's the truth. To come against the false narrative that the Jewish people were not Jews, but people from Western Europe who came and settled in the Middle East and put their foot on the neck of the Palestinians of color. That picture that you see there are Ethiopian Jews in a bomb shelter in southern Israel because Hamas's rockets are indiscriminate. They are aimed at all the Jews in Israel, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of the pigmentation of their skin. They're hiding because the narrative of European colonization is false. Israel is a diverse democracy. Which brings me to the last part here, BDS. Now, if you could just keep in mind the false narrative, not that I want you to rehearse the false narrative, but keep in mind the false narrative of European colonization and imperialism, because that narrative for the last 4 decades has been growing. It's been gaining steam. Again, I'll say to you again, the only reason why BDS and Israel had been associated that way by Israel's enemies is because BDS, if those of you are old enough to remember, was actually how South African apartheid was dismissed, because you had a white minority subjugating the black majority. That was apartheid. Israel's not apartheid. Are there race issues? Absolutely. You're never going to have a society where there aren't any. But apartheid and race issues they're worlds apart. And this is what's important to remember here, that the fuel of BDS is fueled by that same narrative. Omar Barghouti, one of the founders of it, again, when we talk about divesting, part of the mantra for BDS is divesting, boycotting Israel, boycotting academically, boycotting in terms of businesses. And some don't know, some are aware of the fact that one of the founders is actually, he's already gotten his graduate degree and he's pursuing his postgraduate degree in Tel Aviv University. So one thing that was true about apartheid South Africa, divestment was divestment, not divestment and investment. You couldn't do both at the same time. One or the other. And we put a face to boycott, divestment, and sanction? Who's being hurt in Israel when those types of things are discussed? We reveal and we discuss the fact that boycott, divestment, and sanction is not about negotiating for peace. It is about dismissing the Jewish state. This is not about land discussions. This is about whether or not Israel has a right to exist. This is not about 1967 borders. This is about 1947 borders. So, next part here, let's have a brief ending discussion about colonialism, imperialism. Because those words do exist, but they just don't apply to Israel. The gentleman that you see here is Mr. Ben Phillips, the Director of Policy for Oxfam. Oxfam is a human rights organization. Some of you may know this already. Oxfam, and it has been in the media quite a bit here lately, because they are one of the many organizations that are calling for a shutting down of SodaStream, who has a plant in Mishor Adumim. The plant there, which is in the West Bank and what you might want to call the disputed territories, and Kalev will speak more to that. This plant, SodaStream, employs some 1,300 people. 500 of them are Palestinians. Mr. Ben Phillips is sitting comfortably in his suit, in his office, telling SodaStream to close their plant and take the employees and throw him out on the street. That would be a patriarchal, imperialist attitude. What does that mean? He's gainfully employed. So it's no skin off of his nose to tell SodaStream, close the plant. And when he was asked, well, Mr. Phillips, what about the people employed? What about the Palestinians who don't want the place closed? They've been interviewed. They've gone on record. They've gone on camera, which is dangerous for them, and said, we want our job. We want our Israeli wage, Israeli benefit jobs to feed our families. His response is, we are against the settlements. That is an elitist response for somebody who knows how he's going to feed his family at the end of the day. And the reason why we point out these types of things is that not only is Israel not guilty of what they're being accused of, Israel's detractors are actually guilty of. This is elitism. This is better than, this is above. This is someone in the West telling someone else to tell the Palestinians and those that are employed there, you know what? We have to protest, so you have to lose your job. That's really nice to do. I protest, you lose your job. The real protest is, I'm willing to put my job on the line. So we discuss these things by putting faces to these issues and discussing the real world issues that are at stake here and now in Israel. It's multi-ethnic diversity and what it actually means to stand for the only democracy in the Middle East. And so the last question I'll ask, and Kalev will pick up from there, is who indeed is responsible for the mistreatment of the Palestinian people? Thank you.